In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the symbolic meaning of King Arthur's quest. And I'm talking about this today because this is actually part 2 to the last video that I posted, which was about the spiritual meaning or significance of the spring equinox. Now, the spring equinox very much ties in with King Arthur's story, and the reason why is because of the Holy Grail. Now, I went down like a serious rabbit hole with this, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I first started researching, but I ended up putting about 35 hours of research this past week into really discovering the true meaning behind the Holy Grail, digging into King Arthur's quest, his story, his history, his backstory, like his ancestors, stuff like that. Like, this was a deep rabbit hole. A deep one. And I wasn't expecting it to take so long for me to get this part 2 out, but here it is. And I'm super excited to share with you guys because it totally made sense. After all the research that I was doing, I completely made sense of why Spirit was guiding me to talk about this right now and why I was guided to share King Arthur's story and his backstory so that we can get a really clear understanding of what actually transpired and why he was actually searching for the Holy Grail. Because if you guys know anything about King Arthur, then you'll know that he is very closely associated with the Holy Grail, and why is a very interesting story. But before we get into it, I'd like you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss an upload, and check out the description box for all of my different offerings and all the details that you need if you'd like to get in touch with me. Let's get into it. Let's begin with King Arthur's history, but let's begin with his bloodline backstory first. It helps you to understand his personal story once you understand his bloodline and his backstory. So King Arthur's story is essentially a story of the counts in Britain and the spiritual warfare that was taking place at that time, along with the constant fight for power and for rulership. Christianity was definitely regarded highly. Many of the kings actually were Christians and were believers and followers of Jesus. And they were also very spiritual individuals. But because the Celtics were so connected to nature and respected nature and had such a deep relationship with nature, they were also combining that love and connection with nature with the teachings of Jesus. So it was this truly spiritual, not religious type of attitude and level of understanding that people had. This is what their beliefs were. As a little side note here, I just want to mention that this period from about 410, from the time that the Roman Empire basically left British soil, from that moment on to about 1000 AD or roughly 1500 AD, there were so many different dates, so it could be anywhere. They're saying it was about 900 years approximately. For about 900 years, they considered this the Dark Ages. And the reason why was also a little bit vague, to be honest. There were several indications of why it was called the Dark Ages. One reasoning was that it was called that because there was very little information, there was very little scripture, there was very little written word from this time period, so like documentation. But I kind of find that hard to believe, because if people had the capacity to document history, then they most certainly documented that time period. What I was getting continuously was that this information was simply removed or scrubbed from our history books. So the Dark Ages are apparently from about 410 to about 1500 AD. Also known as the Middle Ages, actually. So this is like the medieval period of European history between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance. So that period between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance was this 900-year period of the Dark Ages. This actually was, on the contrary, for what I found in terms of information, was that the Dark Ages was actually even referred to as the Golden Age because it was a highly spiritual time. Like people, like the Celtic people were super spiritual, and they were really, really respectful of Mother Earth, of nature. They were super into the natural world and respected the natural world. But then they also had this very deep connection to Jesus Christ, right? I mean, this is only 400 years after Jesus' death. So like they still had very, very deep influence of Jesus' life, of his story. And as a matter of fact, we'll get into more of the connection with Jesus and King Arthur. Now, King Arthur came from a line of Christian Celtic kings, possibly descended from Joseph of Arimathea. And this is where the connection to Jesus Christ comes in, which I thought was very interesting. So Joseph of Arimathea, from whom a higher standard of morality and behavior was expected. So because King Arthur's bloodline apparently trickled down from Joseph of Arimathea, who we'll get into in a moment who he is, because of this, there was this very high level of morality expected. Joseph of Arimathea was a secret disciple of Jesus. He was actually a very wealthy man, and he had to keep hidden the fact that he believed in Jesus, he believed in his stories, and he very much agreed with Jesus. He knew Jesus was not a hypocrite. He knew he was essentially a follower of Jesus Christ, but he had to do it totally in secret. So while Jesus was alive, because, you know, of how much he was hackled, right, for spreading love and kindness and healing in the world. So Joseph of Arimathea was a secret disciple of Jesus who took responsibility for burying Jesus after his crucifixion. So he was the one who stepped up after Jesus was murdered, and he went to the emperor at the time, Pontius Pilatus, and asked for permission to give Jesus a proper burial. He granted him this request and allowed him. And Joseph actually took Jesus' body and buried him in his own grave, a grave that I guess he had reserved for himself. Now, there's strong evidence that Arthur was a real historic figure, as several kings in the next century named their sons after Arthur, or named their sons Arthur. So, because it's incredible. Like, there was so much information on the internet saying that this was just a legend, King Arthur never truly existed, there was no proof that he existed, and that he was just a myth. But, like, myths always have a backstory, right? And so if there are kings who are naming their sons Arthur after King Arthur, then he must have been a real person, right? So now, in a total reversal from past notions of rulership, the king was expected to rule for the benefit of his people rather than merely for himself and his cronies, as unfortunately was and still is typical of many leaders in today's world. So back in the day, kings actually ruled, basically vowed to rule for the people. So they were not allowed to misuse their power. A model for the noble and proper use of power was introduced in the tales about King Arthur. So basically, the significance of King Arthur is that he was this role model for how people should be ruled. Because let's not forget, King Arthur united Britain and all of the British people. So let me just read to you now the Knight's Pledge. Here's what the Knight's Pledge says. Then the king established all his knights, and to them that were of lands not rich, he gave them lands, and charged them never to do outrageosity nor murder, and always to flee treason. Also by no means to be cruel, but to give mercy unto him that asketh for mercy, and pain upon those who forfeit their worship and lordship of King Arthur forevermore. And always do to ladies, damosels, and gentlewomen succor which means to assist and support them in times of need, upon pain of death. So basically, they were meant to give their life to save another life. Also, that no man take no battles in a wrongful quarrel for no law, nor for worldly goods. So essentially, the pledge that the knights took, the Knights of the Round Table, and this was also King Arthur's pledge, was to never do anything outrageous, never ever murder, and to flee treason, so not to do anything that is considered treason, to not be cruel, to be merciful, and to give mercy for anyone who asks for mercy, and to worship the Lord and King Arthur, so basically to have loyalty towards God and towards King Arthur forevermore, and to always assist and support ladies, gentlewomen, damsels in times of need. So it was a very beautiful, very balanced, very harmonious pledge that the Knights of the Round Table had to take. Unto this were all of the knights sworn of the Round Table, both old and young, and every year they were sworn at the high feast of Pentecost, renewing their vows, spiritual contracts with the king and God. So they repeated this vow every year at Pentecost, which is roughly mid-May. It's about 50 days, I believe, after the spring equinox is when Pentecost is celebrated. The Round Table was created to symbolize the equality of all the knights that sat around it, and that everyone was worthy of being heard. It did not eliminate royal power, but placed limitations on it and directed it to serve others rather than being merely self-serving. So like I said, King Arthur introduced a very revolutionary, very new way of ruling. And he established this because it was passed down to him through bloodlines. And this was how his father ruled and how his uncles ruled, or grandfather, because I still think Ambrosius Aurelianus was his grandfather. Now, the table is also a symbol of feasting and the banquet that God will prepare after the end of the world for souls. So the Round Table truly represented unity, it represented equality, and the king sat at this round table, so they were all equal. No single knight or king or anyone was considered higher than the other. Everyone was considered equal. Everyone's thoughts, suggestions were heard. So they had very special, very deeply spiritual meetings around this round table. Now let's look at the backstory of Arthur's parents and kind of see how they came about, because that was also quite an interesting rabbit hole to go down. So Arthur's father is Uther Pendragon. Now he was, they say, the brother of Ambrosius Aurelianus, or son. Ambrosius Aurelianus, I believe, was King Arthur's grandfather. So Arthur's father is Uther Pendragon, who later becomes King of England and at an Easter feast falls in love with Igraine, the wife of Gorlias, the Duke of Cornwall. So they get invited to this nice Easter feast at another nearby king's or castle. And Uther then sees Igraine there, who is the wife of this king, and completely falls in love with her. Now, Gorlias, her husband, or the king of this nearby nation, he basically ends up dying in a battle very shortly after this Easter feast. And so Uther Pendragon makes a pact with Merlin, who is a psychic master druid. He is a wizard, literally. And if Merlin assists him in winning Igraine, then Uther will give the wizard their firstborn child. Uther subsequently marries Igraine, who then gives birth to Arthur. Arthur is said to have been born at Tintagel Castle in Cornwall and was taken by Merlin to be raised by Sir Ector. Now, this too was really interesting about how Arthur actually grew up, because on the one hand, I found information that said that Uther had willingly, like he offered Merlin his son, as long as Merlin helped him to basically get this other king's wife. And then the other version was that Merlin asked Uther for Uther's firstborn child as payment for helping him to get into the castle and basically to get Igraine and get her to fall in love with Uther. So that was murky. I couldn't quite pinpoint. I probably would have had to spend like another half lifetime just researching and figuring out to try and get to the bottom of it. So I'm kind of putting out the information as best as I could, research and based on what I found. Now, this poisons Uther and Igraine's relationship, ensuring that Uther's crimes would create strife and turmoil for him rather than peace and satisfaction. So it was almost like, again, on the one account, what it was saying that Merlin was trying to make Uther sort of pay for his sins, because one of the 10 commandments is that you are not to lust after someone else's spouse. And because Uther was lusting after someone else's wife, or, I mean, I think he was in love with her, which is different, but either way, he basically wanted for himself this woman that he technically couldn't have, but then because her husband died, he ends up getting her with Merlin's help. So shortly thereafter, civil war broke out in England, and Uther Pendragon is killed, and as his dying act, he thrusts his sword into a stone. Now, in some versions of the story, baby Arthur is taken and raised by Merlin. And if you think about the Disney version of Sword in the Stone, if you've ever seen that movie, really cute movie, by the way, in that story, Merlin is teaching Arthur so that he can get to that point where he can become king. It's like he takes him under his wing type of thing. But in the Disney version, Arthur is living with his foster parent, basically, Sir Ector. In some versions of the story, baby Arthur is taken and raised by Merlin, who forced Uther to agree to give him Igraine's firstborn child as payment for help. After his death, the country is left without a king, because no one was able to draw Uther's sword from the stone, until Arthur grows up and is able to retrieve his father's sword. So Arthur pulls the sword from the stone and is immediately appointed to be king, ordained by God to become king. And so his rulership starts. Now let's get into Arthur's story. So Arthur had 3 half-sisters that he actually wasn't aware of, who were sometimes referred to as sorceresses. So these women, and I just want to kind of point out here, the Celtics really were into Druidism. They really were super connected with nature and alchemy, and had truly magical powers. They were very connected, very gifted individuals. And so his sisters were considered sorceresses because they wielded powers that others feared or didn't understand at the time. Now, Arthur falls in love with Morgan, not knowing that she is one of his half-sisters. They have a son, Mordred, together. And when Arthur finds out what the truth is, and that Morgan is actually his half-sister, he is completely mortified and horrified. And he orders his son, Mordred, to be brought to Caerleon to be put onto an unattended ship and set out to sea. So basically he sends this baby off and kind of wants this baby dead, because he's just so mortified that he impregnated his half-sister. But Mordred is found by a man walking on the shore, who takes the baby home and saves his life. Now, after some time, Arthur meets and instantly falls in love with Guinevere. So he meets Guinevere, and Guinevere, as far as I know, is the daughter of King Leodegrance of Camelard. So she is the daughter of a Scottish king, and he meets Guinevere at an event or a feast of some kind, and immediately falls in love with her. Arthur ends up helping King Leodegrance defeat a rival king, for which he is offered Guinevere. Now, for Arthur, the marriage is more than just a reward or a seal on their alliance. He is actually in love with her. He tells Merlin that he will have only Guinevere as his wife and no one else. Merlin warns him that she will not be faithful, but will fall in love with a knight called Lancelot, and he with her, and they will betray him. So in some versions, Merlin warns King Arthur and tells him, not to marry Guinevere because she's basically going to be unfaithful. But in other versions, this is not true. So there was just so many different versions when it came to Guinevere, because then I went down a whole rabbit hole with Guinevere and researching her backstory. And my God, there was just so many versions that I really couldn't even decide what the heck was truth. So as soon as Lancelot enters the story, Guinevere falls in love with him as deeply as Arthur had fallen in love with her. As long as their affair remains a secret, all is well. But as they become more open in their affection for each other, suspicions are raised, and Arthur is forced to act against his wife and best friend. So remember, Lancelot is one of the knights of the Round Table, right? And a very dear friend to Arthur. So he finds out that the two of them have feelings for each other, and they basically betray Arthur, which completely shatters him. But at the same time, he knows he has to act. So Lancelot escapes before he can be arrested, but Guinevere is taken and condemned to execution at the stake. So he didn't want to obviously do this. He was very much in love with Guinevere, but he felt that he had to, he's king of England. He has to do something and not just, he couldn't just let it slide. Arthur knows Lancelot will come to rescue the queen, which he does, and she then returns to him and asks for forgiveness. So Lancelot ends up coming back, and Guinevere is rescued several times. This poor girl got kidnapped a whole bunch of times from the stories I was reading. But so Lancelot comes back to rescue Guinevere, and she decides at that point that she is going to ask for King Arthur's forgiveness, for her husband's forgiveness, and for him to take her back. She then returns to him, and Arthur is encouraged to blame Lancelot more than Guinevere, and against his wishes, he mobilizes his army to go after his former friend. So once Guinevere is back in the castle with King Arthur, Arthur decides to pursue, basically to hunt down Lancelot, to find him and to persecute him for what he had done, for betraying his oath, the knight's oath, for betraying King Arthur, and for betraying God. So he leaves Guinevere and his kingdom in Mordred's care, because at this point, Mordred comes back into the picture. He was rescued, blah, 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 and is now in connection with Arthur. Arthur makes peace with Mordred, because don't forget, Mordred is his son from his half-sister, right? So they kind of work things out and build a trust within each other. And then Arthur leaves Guinevere and the castle to go and find Lancelot. And while he's away, he leaves everything to Mordred. But Mordred betrays Arthur and attempts to abduct Guinevere and seize power. So Mordred decides that he's going to now make Guinevere his wife, and that he is going to take the throne from Arthur as sort of revenge for Arthur sending him off to die, basically, when he was a baby. The quest for the Holy Grail is thus a metaphor for Arthur's search for redemption and peace. He had established the Round Table and performed many good works as king, but these were not enough. Arthur is grieved by his own failures and seeks for something beyond this world, something higher and deeper. His greatest quest was for the Holy Grail, the cup from which Jesus drank at the Last Supper. This was his attempt to go beyond the natural world, to pierce the magic and limited power of the Druids, as represented by Merlin, and to seek God and heaven. So basically, Arthur has this giant meltdown and realizes that everything that's happening around him, all these traumas, these betrayals, all these different things that he's going through, that this is just not okay, and that he's looking for depth, he's looking for redemption, he's looking for a way to forgive himself, for betraying his half-sister and impregnating her. And so Arthur has this, I think, what in modern times we would call a midlife crisis, or what we would actually call an awakening. So Arthur goes through this massive awakening, essentially, and realizes that, the way everything has played out has been not good, and he really seeks to become even more spiritual, to really free himself of the pain that he has caused, and the pain that was caused to him. So Arthur and his knights go on many quests to find the Holy Grail because, like ripples in a pond, the problems in his family affect ultimately the entire kingdom. A metaphor for how the sins of leaders metastasize into the evils of society, which is so true. If the leaders are not okay and they're not doing well, society is not going to be okay and not going to do well. There's a reason why we appoint leaders, right? So eventually, Sir Galahad, which was one of Arthur's knights, succeeds in his quest to find the Grail because of the purity of his heart. So the reason why all of those quests, all those times that Arthur went out with his knights to find the Holy Grail, the reason why they couldn't find the Holy Grail was because they didn't have that level of purity, that level of consciousness within them to be able to find it. But Sir Galahad succeeds in finding this Grail eventually. So in the concluding fight with Mordred, a symbol of the evil that had arisen within his own family, Arthur kills his son, but is himself fatally wounded and is helped from the field by Sir Bedivere, another of his knights, but almost all of Arthur's other knights are killed. So basically, Arthur hears that Mordred is trying to take over the throne and that he has now kidnapped Guinevere, and he rushes back home and gives up his search for Lancelot, rushes back home to save Guinevere, of course, and to save his kingdom. He ends up killing his son, Mordred, but in the process gets really injured himself, like fatally injured. So he returns his sword, Excalibur, to the Lady of the Lake, surrendering his power and authority. Sir Bedivere helps Arthur into a barge which takes him away to the Isle of Avalon, where he hopes to be cured of his wounds so that he might return to lead his people again. For this reason, Arthur is called the once and future king. So once Arthur goes off to the Isle of Avalon, he unfortunately does not return, so he obviously doesn't make it. And Guinevere is, of course, free of Mordred at this point, and she is pretty devastated from King Arthur's death. And so she enters a convent where she spends the rest of her life in service to others. I believe Guinevere sincerely loved King Arthur. I don't know if, because in some accounts, Guinevere was seduced by Lancelot because he was in love with her. And then in other accounts, she seduced Lancelot. So it's like, again, who knows, right, what the actual truth is. But in many of the texts that I found, Guinevere was actually very much in love with Arthur, and she loved him deeply. She only sees Lancelot once to say goodbye and tell him of her intention to renounce the world. He follows the same path as she, uniting them spiritually in a way they would never again be physically. So there's massive remorse here. Lancelot ends up really regretting his decision as well to get involved with Guinevere. I think they both had major remorse, and that's why they took the spiritual path. A person will not take a spiritual path like that and will not give their life to God unless they had some serious remorse, unless they wanted to make right whatever their sins were, right? So I think they both regretted what they did and the fact that, Arthur ended up dying in this process, because Lancelot was also supposed to come back, and he had promised to come back to King Arthur when he heard that Mordred had taken over and that he kidnapped Guinevere. But Lancelot never showed, apparently. So I think he carried a lot of guilt because of that. King Arthur united Britain and drove off the invading Saxons. He was a benevolent and well-loved king. His reign is known for its heroic deeds and chivalric romance. His character was based on one of the last kings of the Celts prior to the Saxon invasions and re-invasions that eventually ended Celtic power in Britain altogether. So eventually the Saxons completely took over Britain and the Celtic people were driven out. Celtic rulership was replaced by Saxon rulership, which we all know didn't turn out so well. The Saxons weren't spiritual. They weren't connected to nature and to love and to Christ the way that the Celts were. The symbolic meaning of King Arthur's story. So now that you have an understanding of the backstory, or we somewhat have an understanding of the backstory, then we can sort of dissect what symbolically all of this means. King Arthur's story really symbolizes our desire for purpose, nobility, honor, fairness, justice, and love. It also symbolizes our innate selfishness and sinfulness, leading us to betray our own principles and do wrong. It's also symbolizing our search for God and heaven, for a higher meaning and purpose in life, as well as for mercy and divine forgiveness. So King Arthur most definitely was seeking divine forgiveness for his sins, for his wrongdoings, and I think very much realized how important his connection to God was. So in other words, the Arthurian Grail stories contained a number of moral and spiritual themes. One of those themes was the need for adventure and for seeking greatness, as well as the concept of life being a struggle, which should involve a quest for a higher meaning and purpose. So one of the takeaways, or one of the themes, is that we should all be pursuing a life of greatness, of higher meaning and purpose. Another theme of the Arthurian Grail stories is the need to improve conduct, especially for leaders, and to provide paradigms of highness and nobility for both male and female, each in their own way. So this was about having those moral standards for themselves. The third theme was the importance of marriage, and that sexuality should be ideally and fully expressed in the context of a committed relationship. The man should be a servant leader, and the woman should submit and give herself to him. So they had very different principles. They had very different morals and understanding of what a man's role is and what a woman's role is. And in Arthurian times, there was chivalry. Like he was that king that brought chivalry to the forefront and said, women, ladies should be respected, should be honored, and that sexuality was outside of marriage was really actually quite unholy. The fourth theme for this was the reality that morality and spirituality are inseparable. that purity and moral standards are an essential aspect of those who seek God. So again, very deeply spiritual theme here with the Arthurian Grail stories, right? Because morality and spirituality are inseparable. It's not something you can separate. I think spirituality in itself means that you have morals, that you have high standards for living, for loving, for existing. The fifth theme was the idea that a key element of life involves sacrificing oneself for the good of others, that a person is not really living until he or she has something worth dying for. So that was a very deep theme of this. Like King Arthur's quest for the Grail was literally him finding something or searching for something that he was willing to die for. And he was willing to die to find the Grail. He went to great lengths to find it. So it's significant that the Grail is a serving device. And King Arthur was very much that type of a king where he truly served his people. He united his people. Now let's get into the symbolic meaning and messages of the Holy Grail. And this is awesome. It's deep, but it's something that definitely brings profound wisdom to us. And it's very interesting that here we are in 2024, but yet these symbolic meanings of this Holy Grail still 100% apply to today's world and today's life. So the Grail quest is essentially seeking for God and for personal holiness. This is what the Grail represents. The Grail quest is to seek for God and for personal holiness. It's the blessing of both the male and female energies, which I mentioned in the spring equinox video, that the spring equinox also very much represented the coming together, the merging of the masculine and feminine energies, and the beautiful equivalent intertwining of those energies. It is a symbol of ultimate purity and wholeness, a symbolic bridge between the realm of flesh and the divine. So the Holy Grail represents this bridge between the physical world and the spiritual world. It also represents our responsibility to God and the consequences that we must face if we fail to obey Him, if we fail to follow those spiritual moral principles that keep us in alignment, that keep us feeling good and happy and proud of ourselves. It symbolizes that thing we desire above all else, but is very hard to get or achieve, because holiness in modern society is something that most people think of like the Dalai Lama, or they think of, some person sitting up on a mountain meditating. But holiness can be accomplished in our modern world. It doesn't have to be separated from life itself. So as our society has become increasingly secular and self-absorbed, we've developed sophisticated ways of tuning out prophetic messages, marginalizing and excluding God from life. And if you look at our world today, it's exactly what's going on, right? So I just thought that was so interesting. People in the past needed rebuke and correction. Are we equally willing to see the faults of our own culture and change? Many have abandoned the Grail quest, especially in our modern society, right? The quest for God, to rather focus on self. So most people are so much more focused on themselves and on the flesh and the physicality of who they are, rather than focusing on God. So we've created this religion of humanism. We have literally this religion of humanism that I don't even think realized as a society that we created. And we co-created this, right? So surveys in America reveal that people are almost universally interested in spirituality, but they define that word in whatever way suits their own desires, with the worship of self at the center. And this is so true. So when they did statistics and they asked people, it's like 99% of people are super interested in spirituality. I think they feel this innate inquisitiveness, this desire to understand it. But because of how we've created this sort of religion of humanism, they really twist spirituality, and people now really like to use spirituality in a way that suits them, right? And we see this with like the woke culture and like all this like false spiritual leaders and people. It's crazy. The philosophy associated with humanism is that there are no absolutes and truth is relative. You therefore create your own truth, which supposedly cannot be challenged by anyone else because it is true, at least for you. Isn't that interesting? Don't we kind of see that playing out in today's world with all these labels and different things with gender that we've got going on, right? So it's like nowadays you can't even challenge other people's viewpoints. The Romantic movement of the 19th century placed feelings over logic and has become the mantra of Western society. Our counseling methods constantly place the focus on our feelings rather than our responsibilities, and this is so true. Rogerian, or values-free counseling, is one of the most popular methods today, where the counselor is never allowed to provide any solutions and instead assumes the answer is already present somewhere in the counselee's mind and simply needs to be explored and brought to the surface. But this is actually highly inaccurate because you don't know what you don't know. And when someone isn't at a level of consciousness where they understand what they're doing wrong, they have clarity and they see it, if they don't have that level of consciousness, then they're actually going to get nothing out of the counseling session because they're not being provided any solutions for their problems, right? And actually, it's so crazy because while I was doing this research and as I was reading about this, and when it comes to the Holy Grail, it makes so much sense why so many people that I know, even past clients and people I've worked with, that have told me that, oh, you know, they were going to counseling, they were seeing like either a psychologist or a psychotherapist or some type of a counselor, and they said that they were getting nothing out of it. Like there was no benefit to them going for that counseling. Now, biblical counseling, on the other hand, which is based on the counselee learning and absorbing God's standards and changing their ways to bring his or her life into conformance and obedience to God, is the other side of the coin. So again, in doing this research, this is what I kind of discovered, that this is the type of counseling that I offer. So I have no problem calling people out about certain things because it brings them such awareness about how they could have done it differently and why they should have done it differently. And my approach when I'm coaching people is it's about teaching people what God's plan is and how they're meant to live their lives. So it's not about just saying, well, what do you think the answer is? I tell you what the answer is because you need to understand and you need to know what the standards are, what spiritual standards you are not living up to. So that's my method of counseling. And I just thought that was super interesting when I was doing this research, that basically my version of counseling is like biblical counseling. So, which is why I always assign homework. Today's society is very uncomfortable with the words morality, obedience, and submission, and therefore has an absolute rejection of standards for right and wrong. People can then lie, cheat, steal, and philander without being held accountable, and even be proud of themselves and encourage others to do the same, which we can see all over social media. The fakery, the level of fakery our social media has, our media in general has, is proof of this. So the Holy Grail is like full on showing us how we are lying, cheating, stealing, how we are deceiving ourselves and how we are deceiving others through our current ways of being and living. And through this religion of humanism that we have, or that much of society has adopted. Many live their life with little or no real concern for what God wants them to do, and are thus unprepared to face Him. And isn't that the truth? Many have the idea that holiness is impossible and or incompatible with contemporary society. With today's modern world, I think a lot of people don't understand how spirituality can be integrated into your daily life, where it is truly a fulfilling, a meaningful life that you end up living as a result of incorporating spirituality back into your life. People think it takes work and that they're not going to be happy, that they're not going to be able to party or do whatever they want. And that's actually not true. So nothing could be further from the truth, actually. The Bible celebrates enjoyment and even sex. There's so many different verses that I found online that are specifically from the Bible that encourage. It's like God wants nothing more than for us to be happy, to feel fulfilled, to have fun, to really enjoy life. And sex is a part of that enjoyment. As a matter of fact, I found a specific verse about how intimacy is, and basically orgasm, how it is perfection. God saw it as perfection when He created that. So it's not about that. So in other words, there just needs to be a balance in life, right? That's really what it all comes down to. There aren't now and never have been any perfect societies, and we have to make the best of it wherever and whenever we live. So we just kind of have to make the best of what we've got and what we're working with right now in this lifetime. Therefore, the Holy Grail is a call to live a life of adventure, discovery, passion, as well as holiness and peace. There are righteous and unrighteous ways of expressing our desires, and the cost for society ignoring God and morality is astronomical. And this is why I'm sharing this, and this is why I was guided by Spirit to share this message, because God sees all. Societal problems would be mitigated and significantly reduced if people would turn back to God. Each of us can make a choice to do that, which is good and right in our own life. God's nature is unchanging and is unaffected by what we think and believe about Him. God isn't judging. Remember that. God is simply observing, and guiding and loving. That is what God is doing the entire time as we are living out our lives here on earth, observing us and guiding us. And you need to be open to that guidance. You need to be tuned in. You need to want it for you to be able to receive that guidance, right? So God's nature is unchanging and unaffected by what we think. In verse 7 from Galatians chapter 6, it's a very, very true statement. And here's what it says. It says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man sows, this he will also reap." So it's like, it doesn't matter what you do. You are not mocking God. You're actually mocking yourself, and you're screwing yourself over. Because whatever you sow, the law of karma, the universal laws, will return that frequency back to you. Because everything is energy, everything is frequency. So what you think and how pure or impure those thoughts are, that's a vibration that is going out into the universe. how you are feeling, opinions you have about others, how much you judge others. All of this is frequency, and you're emitting that frequency constantly and receiving that frequency back. It's like a boomerang. Everything you do, it's the law of cause and effect, right? So regardless of a person's orientation, beliefs, and how much they wish to escape personal responsibility, each one will still have to stand before God one day and give an account. The entire history of mankind is the story of unholy Grail, how people have sought for the wrong things, and how authority and power has been misused through the ages. Our entire history outlines this, actually, in a very clear way. Jesus Christ is the Holy Grail, and he stands with open arms to welcome those who will seek for him and who are willing to have their lives transformed by his power. So that is the spiritual significance, the symbolic meaning behind the Holy Grail, behind King Arthur's quest for the Holy Grail. And I thought this was really important to share because it's like an outline for what we're experiencing in our modern society. And what my takeaway was after 35 hours of research was that at the end of the day, it just all comes down to choice. And that we each are given an opportunity to choose whether we want to drink from that Holy Grail, whether we are willing to walk a life of morality, of spirituality, and stop excluding God from our lives and from our daily practices, or we can choose to ignore God and to continue living according to this religion of humanism. But the bottom line is, we all will stand before God when our time comes. And we will all have to have our hearts put on scales to see what is heavier, your heart or a feather. And if you've lived a good life, your heart will be light because it will be filled with love and light. But if you've had a bad life and you were selfish and deceitful and lived a life that only served you, your heart will be heavy. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it all the way through, amazing. Thank you. Thank yourself, because this message is important. We are in a time, a very critical time, I believe, right now, where we really truly must make a choice. And it's important that people understand our history. Without understanding our history and our past, we do not have a future. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.